It's great that we have all these startups. It's great that we're attracting all this venture capital. It's great that we get these big exits. But in many cases, these end up being relatively small companies in the tech sector. And so the question is,
Yeah.
maybe Steve, you can also weigh in on this too, from the drive to become the next startup ecosystem, whether it's in New York or around the world, why do we all care so much about startups? Why is this important?
Can I add just a couple things to that? Because we as economic developers, we have to, we care not just about the number of jobs, but the quality of those jobs. I think there are a couple of reasons why we've invested so much. One is that as that tech ecosystem has grown, and by some counts it's 300,000 jobs, and that we could probably spend an entire panel defining what a tech job is in New York City, but we think there is an opportunity there, given the wages in those types of positions, and also the spectrum of occupations, to really provide opportunities for the people of the city to have gainful employment and to advance their careers. But as importantly, while any particular startup might be small, what we've seen, and one of the things we like saying and really thinking about, is that it's not just tech. We've really developed a hyphen tech type of economy, that the disruption that is happening in the more legacy industries, whether it's finance or media or fashion, that the growth of tech, and those companies might be small, have a real profound impact in ensuring that the legacy industries are sustainable over time and can evolve.
So, you know, what's really interesting is what I just heard is that New York has been entrepreneurial since George II. It's really interesting to compare and contrast the trajectory of New York with the trajectory of Singapore versus the trajectory of Detroit. You know, and Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley, as I said, started out as Defense Valley, Microwave Valley, Silicon Valley, Web Valley, Web 2.0 Valley, and has had a great culture of reinventing itself. If you look at Singapore, that is the DNA of that nation. If you look at New York over the last 50 or 60 years, it's also had that resiliency, and I think that's the key word. If we look at Detroit, for whatever reason, it was a one-note song, and in fact, when we ran out of that note, we're still looking for the next one. And I find it interesting to want to deconstruct what goes on in New York versus what happened elsewhere. The other observation I'll make is, let me just finish the thought, is your comment about New York 1.0 being in the 90s versus yours, no, it actually started in 2007, is in fact the story of that resilience, is that if New York hadn't been resilient, and my observation as an outsider was that the second wave was actually engineered, that first wave would have been a stillborn wave and not recovered. But in fact, New York figured out how to diversify itself and actually built on top of its strengths in finance, in ad tech, in whatever. The other piece that has been going on is, I'm old enough to remember the cost of starting a software company when I started as an entrepreneur was $4 million. The price of a software startup has dropped by a factor of 1,000 in my lifetime. It used to cost $1 million to buy a computer called a VAX. It used to cost $1 million to buy software for that computer, because you did what was called waterfall engineering. It took you 2 to 3 years to ship software, so that was another $1 million. And because you were always late in your forecast, we'll throw in another $1 million. Today, computing is a utility. If you ever see your young entrepreneurs sitting in coffee shops, they're actually connected to more computing horsepower than existed in the world when I was an entrepreneur, and they're paying pennies per minute to access it. Amazon Web Services have turned computing resources into a utility. We don't see that, and we don't appreciate it, but that is one of the pieces that powered the entrepreneurial revival all over.
And that was very important for New York, because that helped get over some of the traditional barriers of New York, which is high cost, you know, where do you start a company? And the fact that you could start in Starbucks allowed a much greater number of people to do that. But the other thing I would say is, we were at risk of becoming Detroit. I mean, financial services was like 30% of the tax revenues. I mean, so we were kind of we were heading down the path of being a little bit of a one note. And so I think from an economic development perspective, that got people's attention, and that was sort of, I know certainly, from our and EDC's perspective, a big focus which was saying we don't want to be that way. We can't be that dependent because that is never a good outcome.
And if you had Fred Wilson here from Union Square Ventures, he would tell you the other missing piece from New York was venture capital at scale. That is, almost every city I see has great entrepreneurs, but no one capable of writing checks north of millions of dollars. And having just entrepreneurs without risk capital is like having one hand clapping. It doesn't make much noise. And the irony was, here you were in the financial capital of the world, but it was not the risk capital of the world, at least for early stage ventures. And I think that's radically changed. Again, I'll use Fred, who happens to be on the West Coast this week, but as kind of the proxy for, venture capital kind of raised itself up along with New York and others stepping up to the plate where you can now actually get large checks, maybe still not on the scale of an Andreessen and Horowitz are raising $1 billion, but pretty serious money being raised and staying in New York City, which never existed before.
And he was backed by a large bank.
Right.
That's where his capital came from.